The words that touch an avoidant deeper than love don't sound like poetry, and they don't feel like grand emotional declarations either. In fact, they often sound almost too simple to matter at first. But that's exactly where most people get it wrong. Because in relationships where emotional closeness feels complicated, the loudest expressions are not always the ones that land. Sometimes what actually reaches someone is the quietest form of communication possible, a sentence that carries no pressure, no demand, no emotional urgency trying to force a reaction. And that's the strange paradox at the center of avoidant attachment. The more emotionally intense the message, the more likely it is to activate distance, but the calmer and more grounded the communication, the more it slips past defenses that usually stay firmly in place. It's not that they don't feel deeply, it's that their emotional system is calibrated to respond differently to intensity versus safety. And if you've ever felt like your words were too much for someone who still cared in their own way, this is where that confusion finally starts to make sense. Before we go deeper, make sure you're subscribed because what you're about to hear isn't about manipulating emotions, it's about understanding them in a way that actually changes how connection works at its core. Most people assume that if someone pulls away emotionally, the answer is to love harder, speak more openly, or express feelings with greater intensity. But with avoidant attachment patterns, emotional intensity often doesn't translate into closeness. It translates into pressure. And pressure, even when it comes from love, can trigger the internal need to create space. This is why conversations that are meant to bring people closer sometimes end up creating distance instead. It's not because the emotions are wrong, but because the nervous system on the receiving end is interpreting emotional depth as something that requires a response they may not feel internally prepared to give. So instead of opening up, they begin to regulate by stepping back, not out of lack of feeling, but out of a need to regain internal equilibrium. This is where communication becomes less about what is said and more about how it is experienced emotionally. And that experience is often shaped more by tone, expectation, and pressure than by the words themselves. And this leads to one of the most misunderstood dynamics in avoidant relationships, the idea that emotional need will naturally create emotional closeness. In reality, phrases like "I need you" or "I can't do this without you," or even emotionally charged explanations of feelings can sometimes create the opposite effect. Not because those words lack truth, but because they introduce a sense of emotional responsibility that feels heavy to hold in moments where the other person is already managing internal distance. For someone who processes closeness differently, emotional dependency can feel less like intimacy and more like an unspoken expectation they may not feel fully equipped to meet consistently. And when emotional responsibility feels too large, the instinct is not always to engage more deeply, it is to step back just enough to feel grounded again. This is where many connections unintentionally start to shift, not because of a lack of love, but because of a mismatch in how emotional pressure is being interpreted on both sides. What actually gets through in those moments is not intensity, but clarity without demand. Not emotional escalation, but emotional stability. This is where the psychology becomes almost counterintuitive, because the words that land deepest are often the ones that ask for the least in return. A calm acknowledgement instead of an emotional appeal, a grounded observation instead of an emotional reaction, a statement that simply exists without trying to pull anything back from the other person. Because when emotional space is not being pressured, the nervous system on the avoidant side doesn't feel the need to retreat as a form of self-regulation. Instead, it begins to register the interaction differently, not as something that requires escape or correction, but as something that feels safe enough to remain present within. And this is where the first type of language begins to matter deeply: observational statements. These are not emotionally charged confessions or attempts to fix a connection, but simple reflections of reality without expectation attached to them. The reason they are powerful is not because they change the other person directly, but because they remove emotional friction from the interaction itself. When someone says something like what they notice, how they feel in a grounded way, or what is happening without turning it into pressure for response, it creates an environment where defensiveness is less likely to activate. And in avoidant dynamics, reduced defensiveness is the first real opening for emotional presence to return naturally. It is not about convincing someone to stay closer, it is about removing the emotional conditions that make them feel like they need to leave in the first place. And underneath all of this sits a deeper truth that most people only understand after experiencing the pattern directly. Being understood often matters more than being emotionally overwhelmed. Because when emotional communication is constantly intense, the message can become harder to process, not because it lacks meaning, but because it carries too much emotional demand at once. But when communication becomes clear, steady, and non-pressuring, something shifts internally. It creates space for the other person to actually receive what is being expressed without feeling emotionally overloaded by it. And in that space, understanding becomes possible again, not forced, not rushed, but naturally accessible. And that is where connection begins to feel safe enough to re-enter itself, not through emotional intensity, but through emotional ease. And once understanding starts to feel possible again, the next layer of communication becomes even more important, not because it adds intensity, but because it removes pressure while still preserving connection. This is where the second type of language comes in, words that give space without abandonment. Because one of the deepest fears in avoidant dynamics is not simply closeness, but the feeling of being emotionally cornered by it. When someone senses that every interaction carries an expectation of continued engagement, emotional response, or immediate closeness, the internal system can begin to contract as a form of self-protection. But when communication carries a message of presence without pressure, something that says, "I am here, but I am not demanding anything from you right now," it creates a very different emotional environment. It signals availability without intrusion, connection without force, and presence without obligation. And that balance is what allows emotional walls to soften without triggering the instinct to rebuild them. This is why avoidants often respond more openly to calm, spaced communication than to emotionally saturated conversations that try to resolve everything at once, because emotional safety in this context is not created through more emotional output, it is created through reduced emotional demand. When there is no pressure to respond in a specific way or within a specific emotional depth, the interaction becomes easier to stay within, and over time that ease begins to recondition how closeness is experienced. Instead of closeness being linked to internal overwhelm, it begins to be linked even subtly with stability, and that shift is what eventually allows reconnection to happen in a way that doesn't immediately trigger withdrawal. And this is where the third type of language becomes essential: validation without expectation. Because validation, when tied to emotional demand, loses its grounding effect and becomes another form of pressure. But validation that simply acknowledges experience without trying to change it, fix it, or extract a response from it operates differently. It allows the other person's emotional state to exist without resistance. And for someone who tends to withdraw when emotions feel too heavy or too directive, this kind of communication feels significantly safer to process. It doesn't require them to adjust, defend, or match intensity. It simply reflects understanding. And in many cases, being understood without being pushed to respond is what allows emotional defensiveness to slowly decrease over time. What makes this so powerful is that it shifts communication away from outcome-based interaction and into presence-based interaction. Instead of every message carrying an implicit goal, reconnection, reassurance, resolution, it becomes grounded in simply acknowledging what is real in the moment. And when communication stops trying to control emotional outcomes, something interesting begins to happen on the receiving side. The interaction no longer feels like something that demands emotional energy to navigate. It becomes something that can be entered without pressure and exited without consequence. And that emotional freedom, paradoxically, is what often makes engagement feel more sustainable rather than less. But there is also an important warning hidden within this dynamic that most people overlook. Because when communication becomes too focused on explanation, correction, or emotional fixing, it can unintentionally activate the very resistance it is trying to reduce. Over-explaining emotions, trying to make someone understand every detail of how you feel in the hope of getting closeness back, often increases emotional weight rather than reducing it. Not because the feelings are invalid, but because the volume of emotional information being presented at once can feel overwhelming to process in real time. And when emotional processing becomes overwhelming, the natural response is not deeper engagement, it is withdrawal for regulation. This is why sometimes less communication but more grounded communication creates more connection than continuous emotional elaboration. And this leads directly into the fourth type of language, the calm emotional anchoring statement. These are not designed to persuade or convince, and they are not meant to extract reassurance. Instead, they function as emotional stabilizers within interaction. They communicate presence without escalation, clarity without intensity, and emotional steadiness without pressure for reciprocity. And when someone who is prone to emotional withdrawal encounters this kind of grounded communication, it can subtly shift the internal perception of the interaction itself. Instead of feeling like something that demands emotional output, it begins to feel like something that exists safely on its own terms. And that shift is important because emotional openness is far more likely to emerge in environments where there is no perceived threat of emotional overload. And finally, beneath all of this communication psychology lies a quieter but more powerful truth, the idea that silence, when used correctly, is not absence but structure. Silence in this context is not about punishment, withdrawal, or emotional games. It is about allowing emotional space to exist without filling it immediately with explanation or reassurance. Because when everything is constantly explained, emotionally processed, or verbally resolved, there is no room left for internal reflection on the other side. But when silence is calm, grounded, and not emotionally charged, it creates space for processing rather than reacting. And in that space, emotional meaning begins to form internally rather than being forced externally. That is often where deeper recognition begins, not through more words, but through the absence of pressure to respond to them immediately. And once silence is no longer experienced as pressure, but as space, something very subtle begins to change in how emotional presence is processed internally. Because now, instead of every interaction being immediately filled with response, explanation, or emotional reaction, there is room for thought to develop on its own terms. And that is where the hidden shift begins, the transition from reactive communication to reflective perception. In reactive communication, everything is immediate. Feelings are expressed, answered, and resolved in real time. But in reflective perception, emotional meaning lingers. It doesn't disappear after the moment passes. It continues to exist in the background, slowly reorganizing itself. And when communication is calm enough not to disrupt that process, the emotional imprint of it becomes deeper, not louder. This is where presence starts to feel different, not more intense, but more memorable, because it is no longer being constantly overwritten by new emotional noise. And this is where the fifth layer begins to reveal itself, the hidden trigger that most people completely overlook, which is emotional safety without emotional need. Because the deepest shift in avoidant dynamics does not happen when someone feels wanted or pursued or emotionally charged toward. It happens when they begin to feel that emotional interaction is no longer a demand placed on them. When there is no longer an expectation of immediate emotional alignment, no pressure to respond at a certain depth, no subtle obligation to regulate someone else's emotional state, something changes internally. The nervous system stops preparing for emotional demand and starts recognizing the interaction as something it can enter without losing internal balance. And that is where real openness begins to re-enter, not because walls were forced down, but because the environment no longer triggers the need to keep them up. But here is where most people misinterpret this stage entirely. They assume that emotional safety means emotional closeness, but in avoidant attachment patterns, safety is often the prerequisite for closeness, not the result of it. If safety is missing, closeness will feel unsustainable. If safety is present, closeness becomes possible again, but not guaranteed. And that distinction is important because it removes the idea of control from the process. You are not forcing connection by saying the right things. You are creating conditions where connection is no longer perceived as emotionally overwhelming. And that shift alone is often what allows previously distant dynamics to soften in a way that feels natural rather than forced. And as this emotional safety builds, something quieter but more significant begins to happen in the background, the reclassification of your presence. Because in avoidant attachment systems, people are often categorized internally based on how they feel to engage with. Not just how they look or what they say, but how their presence impacts internal emotional regulation. If someone is associated with emotional pressure, unpredictability, or intensity, the nervous system will naturally create distance over time as a form of regulation. But if someone is associated with calmness, clarity, and emotional steadiness, the internal system begins to reassign them into a different category, one that does not trigger the same protective response. And this is where perception begins to shift in a way that is not immediately visible from the outside, but deeply felt internally over time. This is also where emotional anchoring statements begin to show their true effect, not as tools of influence, but as signals of stability. Because when someone communicates without urgency, without emotional escalation, and without attempting to control outcomes, it creates a reference point for what interaction with them feels like. And over time, that reference point becomes the emotional baseline. So instead of interaction being associated with unpredictability, it begins to be associated with steadiness. And steadiness in systems that are highly sensitive to emotional intensity becomes increasingly valuable, not because it is exciting, but because it is sustainable. And sustainability is what allows re-engagement to feel safe rather than overwhelming. But there is still another layer that sits underneath this entire process, and it is often the one that determines whether connection deepens or fades completely. And that layer is expectation. Because even when communication is calm, even when words are carefully chosen, even when emotional pressure is reduced, expectation can still exist silently beneath the surface. The expectation of a certain response, the expectation of emotional reciprocity, the expectation of gradual change. And even if these expectations are never spoken, they are often felt. And when they are felt, they can subtly reintroduce pressure into an interaction that otherwise feels safe. This is why true emotional impact does not come from controlling what is said, but from releasing the need for specific outcomes to happen immediately. And this leads into one of the most misunderstood truths in all of this psychology. Words do not touch avoidance deeper than love because they are stronger than love. They touch deeper because they are free of emotional demand. They are not trying to pull, fix, or secure something in the moment. They exist without forcing direction. And in that absence of force, something paradoxically opens. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, through repeated experiences of emotional interaction that do not require internal defense. And over time, that lack of defense becomes familiarity. And familiarity without pressure is often the first real condition under which deeper emotional reconnection can begin to take shape again. And once familiarity begins to form without pressure attached to it, something even more delicate starts to unfold underneath the surface of the dynamic. Because now the interaction is no longer being evaluated in real time as something that demands emotional output, it is being stored. Not as urgency, not as reaction, but as experience. And experiences that are stored without emotional friction tend to resurface later in a very different way than those that are constantly charged in the moment. They don't burn out quickly, they linger. They return quietly in thoughts that don't feel forced. And when someone's nervous system is no longer bracing for emotional intensity every time your presence appears, their mind begins to revisit you in a softer register. Not as someone who creates pressure, but as someone who represents a different emotional texture. And that texture is what begins to slowly separate you from the background noise of other interactions. This is where the psychological shift becomes almost invisible from the outside, but extremely active internally. Because now, instead of responding to you only when you are present, the mind begins to process you when you are absent. And that is the real turning point that most people never notice while it is happening. When communication was emotionally intense or pressure-filled, absence often created relief or disconnection. But when communication becomes grounded, steady, and emotionally safe, absence starts to feel different. It stops feeling like escape and begins to feel like contrast. And contrast is what gives emotional memory its depth. Without contrast, everything blends together. With contrast, certain moments begin to stand out. And when your presence stands out even slightly in memory, it starts to occupy more cognitive space than it did before. And as that cognitive space increases, something very subtle begins to take shape: reflection without resistance. Because now, instead of immediately pushing away thoughts connected to emotional interaction, the mind can revisit them without triggering internal defense. This is where meaning begins to reorganize itself. Moments that once passed without attention are now reconsidered, not because they were significant in isolation, but because the emotional environment around them has changed. A calm message that once felt neutral might now feel grounding in hindsight. A steady response that once seemed simple might now feel noticeably different compared to more emotionally charged interactions elsewhere. And slowly, without any dramatic realization, the perception of you begins to shift from something that is simply known to something that is quietly felt in absence. And this is where